This is The Red Line, where we interview three expert witnesses on one big issue shaping the news both here and overseas. And I'm your host, Michael Hilliard. As part of my work over the years, I've often travelled to countries that many would regard as dangerous or unstable. The thing is though, that most of the time, most places are pretty fine, and I usually leave very happy to have visited the country. Because of this, a question always comes up in interviews to me. What nation would I draw the line at? Which country would I regard as simply too risky to enter or ever report from on the ground? And near the top of that list is this week's focus country, Somalia, a nation almost analogous with a failed state, a country that has fought on both sides of the Cold War, and a nation that is now being used as a dumping ground for everything from guns to nuclear waste. The country has been in turmoil for decades now, and it would be hard to think of another nation in worse shape than current-day Somalia, especially with the threat of Al-Shabab at the very doorstep of Mogadishu. But how did we get here? How did Somalia, a once wealthy kingdom, fall into its current state? And what is being done to turn the country's fate around? And more importantly, why are its neighbours in Ethiopia and Kenya working so hard to make sure Somalia doesn't get back on its feet? Well, for that, we turn to our first guest.
Part 1. A failed state?
I would say it's a very complicated situation where you're trying to resurrect central governments after a decade of collapse. And on top of that, you have a security dynamic driven by an Al-Shabab insurgency that is Islamist in nature.
Omar Mahmood is a senior analyst for the crisis group focusing on Somalia and Chad. He's also an ex-member of the Institute of Security Studies and an ex-member of the Peace Corps, focusing on East Africa. He joins us today.
Well, in Somalia, you're still trying to resurrect central governance. So basically in 1991, the state more or less collapsed. And so since then, efforts from the international community in particular have focused on resurrecting some sort of central authority. Now, that is kind of there now. It is there now, but it's still extending itself. So it hasn't really established itself. It doesn't have the same credibility, legitimacy, or ability to project itself internally as governments do in Kenya or Ethiopia, for example. On top of that, you've had other sort of competing sources of power to that, which is either at a local level or groups that are outside the system, like Al-Shabab, threatening the system as well. So I think it's really a long-term process of trying to get Somalia back on its feet. You know, it's basically been a generation without a state or with smaller governance, administrations and whatnot. And I think, honestly, it's going to take about a generation to continue forward. But we have seen progress over the past 5-10 years. And so you're seeing those signs develop, but it is very much a long-term game. It's not always linear. It's sometimes 2 steps forward, one step back.
So what we think of today as the Republic of Somalia is actually very different to what a lot of Somalis would regard as Somalia. To start with, can you explain what the concept of Greater Somalia is?
Sure. Well, Greater Somalia refers to this idea that all areas territorially that are inhabited by ethnic Somalis should be united into one sort of nation state or one sort of entity. And this is basically a legacy of colonialism. So you have more or less 5 areas where Somalis inhabit, but when we talk about Somalia, that's just one of them. So on top of that, you have the Northeast province in Kenya. You have the Ogaden region of Ethiopia. You have Djibouti, and then you have Somaliland, which was in a union with Somalia as well for about 30 years, but has since dissolved that and proclaims its independence. So Greater Somalia really refers to all 5 of those areas. And, you know, it's no coincidence that the star on the Somali flag actually has 5 points, one for each of these areas. So that's kind of the difference. Areas where ethnic Somalis inhabit versus Somalia is what we think of as the modern nation state of Somalia.
Greater Somalia once held quite good influence over the East African region. But in the 1880s, Somalia was colonized by the French, British, and Italians for the proximity to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, or the entrance to the Red Sea. So Somalia was broken into 5 parts, the divisions of which are still present to this day. The French colonized the northern tip of Somalia, around the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which today is the nation of Djibouti. The Ogaden Desert region of Somalia, or the far west of it, became part of what is today eastern Ethiopia, and the southern tip of Somalia was given to the British colony of Kenya, making up about a third of their territory. What remained is the current borders of Somalia, a nation kind of shaped like a number 7. So if you imagine that top part of the 7, that became the British colony of Somaliland, and to this day they are vying for independence from the rest of Somalia, and we'll get to that later. The remaining slanted bit of that 7 shape was colonized by the Italians, known as Italian Somaliland, and this contains the current day capital, Mogadishu. So one of the overarching goals of Somalia has always been to reunite all of the Somali territory under a Somalian flag again. But this has led to them going to war with both Kenya and Ethiopia over the years, particularly under the umbrella of the Cold War. So can you explain a bit more about that?
Sure. No, I mean, the Cold War is a very interesting story for Somalia in particular, or for the Horn, I guess I should say, because basically you have this rivalry between Ethiopia and Somalia, and a lot of that has to do with this idea of Greater Somalia. And at the time, Somalia still saw or had opportunities to try to bring the Ogaden region of Ethiopia under Somalia. So it's still tied in with this objective of uniting all of these Somali parts. But then you throw this layer on top of that of the Cold War, and so the superpowers supporting different sides. And so initially, you did have the USSR support to Somalia, but through the process of the Ogaden War, when Siad Barre basically was previously supporting insurgent groups in Ogaden, but basically took that to a whole new level and actually invaded the Ogaden, the superpower dynamics switched sides completely. And so the USSR started supporting this new Derg regime in Ethiopia. And so that inevitably meant that they pulled their support from Somalia, given the interconnectedness of these two layers and the disputes. And so that led to, obviously, USSR support, but also Cuban troops, which really turned the tide of that war and was a huge turning point in Somalia, which had made major gains in the Ogaden, but ultimately those gains were reversed. And Somalia suffered defeat in that war and brought a lot of the tensions around the Siad Barre regime to the surface. And then you saw how how they reacted domestically changed after that as well and became a bit more repressive and whatnot. So this is a huge turning point in Ethiopian-Somalia Horn relations, but also internally in Somalia itself. And so it's not divorced from external rivalries that we saw during the Cold War, but really they actively played a role within that.
And they actually went to war with Kenya as well, didn't they?
Yeah, so that was at the time, again, it ties into this Greater Somalia idea where in the northern parts of Kenya, which are ethnically, a lot of them ethnically Somali inhabited as well, this idea that they were given a referendum to vote at the time of decolonization, which side they wanted to join. And then that referendum pointed towards joining Somalia's side, but that wasn't really respected by the new Kenyan authorities in Nairobi. And so it was basically this kind of reaction to that in the shift to war. And so Somalia, at the time, of decolonization, they were the one country in Africa that did not accept the colonial boundaries. There was this Cairo Declaration, which a lot of other countries signed up to, but Somalia conspicuously did not. And so it ties into this idea of trying to reunite all of the Somali inhabited areas. And so, one means of doing that was supporting insurgencies and sort of proxy actors that were challenging states at that time. And so supporting some of the insurgent actors in northeast Kenya who were fighting basically the Nairobi government to reunite with Somalia.
And the foreign intervention really didn't stop there either. In 1991, President Clinton of the US sent in American soldiers to Somalia. So why did American soldiers go into Somalia in the 90s, and what was Clinton hoping to achieve with this intervention?
Well, so basically, 1991 was the culmination of state collapse in Somalia. So this has been bubbling for a while. I think the loss of the Ogaden War was a turning point, and dictator Siad Barre at the time became increasingly a bit more repressive, and you started to see challenges to his rule pop up in Somalia as well. And of course, some actors like Ethiopia, which had been basically at the brunt of Somali proxy support for rebels in their country, also in turn supported some of these rebels against Barre as well. So you see this competing proxy war dynamic. But basically, a number of these had mushroomed, and by the late 80s, Barre's tenure was becoming increasingly untenable. And so that mushroomed in 1991, where he fled the capital, Mogadishu. And so unfortunately here you see very different stories popping up in different parts of Somalia. And in Mogadishu itself became the battleground between two more or less clan militias. And it very much divided the city, but also the fighting actually led to its destruction in a lot of ways. And so I think the U.S. and also the UN's intervention at this time was to basically put a pause on some of these dynamics. There was also a massive humanitarian crisis going on, a food security crisis. So also, responding to the very specific humanitarian needs. But it also tied into this idea of this post-Cold War order where the U.S. is leading its military advantage for, the sort of betterment of I guess, a new world order, and kind of resolving some active conflicts and putting its power to use in that way. I think there was this idea also that, the collapse of Somalia could very much threaten the region of the Horn of Africa, and I think we've seen that hold true in a number of ways since then. And so for a lot of reasons, Somalia was at a very pivotal juncture, and the U.S. and others in the international community thought some sort of intervention could kind of reverse that tide.
And how successful was that intervention?
I'd say it was not successful at all. Basically, these international actors got involved in a very complex situation, and at times inadvertently wound up supporting certain actors, or their relations became adversarial with certain actors, turning them into a party to the conflict. The sort of international assistance and aid became also something that was fought over. So again, also became a resource within the competition and the conflicting powers as well within Somalia. And so I think you had, a series of very tough engagements, and then eventually, this is highlighted particularly by the infamous Black Hawk Down incident and whatnot. But basically, you had the international community pull out and decide, they weren't making progress there. It's too complicated of a situation, too much of a mess, and just kind of left. And so all those ideals and objectives they were trying to achieve never really got achieved.
So after all these interventions, Somalia is very fractured. In fact, it's more like 4 nations living under one boundary these days. Sticking to our description of the shape of the number 7, the bottom third of the 7 slant is Jubaland, home to Mogadishu. Around 40% of Jubaland is currently under the control of Al-Shabab, who do not answer to the Somalian government, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. The top half of this 7 slant is known as Puntland, who are semi-detached from the central government in Mogadishu, and the base from where a lot of international piracy originated. The last, and the former British territory, is the flat bit on top of the 7, who are seemingly a lot more stable than the rest of the country, and have been pushing for their own independence as Somaliland for years now. So can you take us through how we got to this point, a nation that's almost broken into 4 pieces?
So I would describe it probably on a 3-tiered level, basically. And so you have this idea of federalism in Somalia. And so by that, I mean that there's a central authority based in Mogadishu, but outside of that, you have other entities that have sprung up through various ways, some independently on their own, some through bottom-up processes, some through, federal government intervention as well. But you have various federal member states that operate at a level below Mogadishu and work in concert, in theory, with Mogadishu. And so that's where you find Jubaland, Puntland, but there's a few others, Southwest and Hirshabelle as well. And so these don't claim to be independent. They claim to have a degree of autonomy. Now, that degree of autonomy is still very much contested vis-a-vis Mogadishu. There's never really been a good comprehensive settlement in terms of how the power sharing arrangements are going to work, the resource sharing arrangements, the institutions that would govern this, such as the Constitution, remain provisional and honestly unclear on a lot of this and even contradictory at times. And so you see that constant tension in that dynamic where Mogadishu is trying to assert itself, but that comes at the expense of some of the federal member states, particularly Puntland and Jubaland lead the charge here. Now, Puntland's also a very interesting case study because it emerged prior to the current central government. And in 1998, some of the clans there kind of got together and started creating this own administration. So it really predates the federal government, but it's never sought independence, just a high degree of autonomy. But its relations with Mogadishu kind of ebb and flow, basically depending on whether Puntland feels this autonomy is being threatened or not. Now, Somaliland's a different case because it has overtly declared independence. It says it's not part of this federalism system in Mogadishu, even though Mogadishu carves out a role for it. It says it doesn't participate. Basically, since 1991, it said its active union with Somalia has been dissolved. And so Somaliland also has, they back this up through a distinct colonial history as they were colonized by the British while the rest of Somalia was colonized by the Italians, and that they had basically achieved independence a few days earlier than Somalia and actively, voted to engage in a union. And then so they view it as kind of a choice, and now their choice is dissolve that. So Somaliland's completely declared its independence and doesn't really engage with Mogadishu. For its part, it treats itself as a sovereign nation, has relations with external countries, and takes on a lot of the tasks you would expect a sovereign nation to do. Mogadishu doesn't really have much influence in there. So it does act basically independently. And that's a crucial difference between Puntland and Jubaland, which might sometimes take on some of those efforts, but not to the full extent Somaliland does. Now, on top of that, as you mentioned, you have the Al-Shabab Insurgency. And so Al-Shabaab's obviously not part of this federal system, but is an actor outside of it. They do control large amounts of territory, especially in southern Somalia. And they've been basically the actor outside the system, challenging the federal government and the implementation of this federal system at all sort of corners. And basically what you have is you're actually trying to build up the federal government in opposition to Al-Shabab. Al-Shabab at the time was controlling more territory and ruling a lot of south central Somalia. So the federal government's rise in power is coming at the expense of Al-Shabab. That's kind of a reverse situation that we see from other Islamist insurgent movements on the continent, where they're kind of taking over areas where the federal government either has kind of retrenched or they're taking power from the federal government. This is really the opposite situation, and so Al-Shabaab's basically the latest line in a long line of very conservative Islamist movements in Somalia, but been the most successful, particularly in terms of its military force. And so they've been able to hold territory, even though they've lost some of it over the past few years, but still hold a substantial amount of territory in the country.
So from speaking with people who work in the area, Somaliland seems to be a lot more stable than Puntland or Jubaland. Less car bombings, more authority, and even a quick Google Maps search and a look around shows a stark contrast in living standards. Why is Somaliland so much more stable than the rest of Somalia?
No, it's definitely a correct assumption. Somaliland basically internally was able to consolidate itself. It still went through a series of civil unrest after basically the territory was liberated from Siad Barre's control by the SNM, the Somali National Movement. But basically it was able to consolidate its control. One of the key dynamics is that there's a main clan, the Isak clan, which has control of basically the central part. But basically, yeah, Somaliland was able to through a series of kind of bottom-up grassroots conferences and interventions, basically able to come to some sort of accommodation in a way that just didn't happen in southern Somalia. Rather, Mogadishu was actively fought over, while Hargeisa, and part of this was because, Hargeisa had been leveled, Somaliland had been destroyed in this fight against the Bari dictatorship, that they were able to come together after that in a manner that southern Somalia did not.
So whilst the Somalian government tolerates Somaliland, it is actively fighting Al-Shabab. So who are Al-Shabab?
So Al-Shabab is aligned to Al-Qaeda. They've formalized that alliance after bin Laden's death, but had a relationship before that, and they've remained steadfast aligned to this, and even really repressing internally some of their own members that sought to join the Islamic State when it burst onto the scene a few years ago, so very much remain within the Al-Qaeda wing and Al-Qaeda frame. The way I usually describe Al-Shabaab is it's not just a terrorist actor, but it's a governing actor. It's a governing actor that engages in terrorism, more or less. And so in that sense, it's really very much a competitor to the federal government. Al-Shabaab controls large portions of South and Central Somalia, so some of these have been taken back through advances by the African Union peacekeeping mission, by the AMISOM mission over the past few years, but this is kind of stalled, and so you have this status quo set in where Al-Shabaab has some strongholds in South Central Somalia, particularly Middle Juba, and in some other areas of the country, and there hasn't been much movement to take back those over the past few years. And so Al-Shabaab, it's a number of things at once. It's a governing institution. It's one guided by very conservative Islamist ideology, very much similar in the wing of Al-Qaeda. And this is more or less a continuation of a number of movements that have been present in Somalia, particularly since state collapse, but even before that. And so Al-Shabaab is really just the latest iteration of this very conservative ideology, which aligns very closely with some imports from Gulf ideologies around Wahhabism and Salafism, and so they fall within that wing. In that sense, they are also an Islamist actor. They're a governing actor, but there's also a terrorist element to it, and so they actively engage in acts of terrorism and in Mogadishu and other parts of the country. And they're also, in a lot of ways, a criminal actor as well. They've been quite good about generating sources of finance internally within the country. I wouldn't say that this question comes up all the time. Is Al-Shabaab a locally generated entity, or is it really very much supported externally? Al-Shabaab has that external relationship with Al-Qaeda, but they very much stand on their own. And so they've been able to generate financing through illegal smuggling of charcoal and sugar and these sort of commodities, through checkpoints within the region, and raise enough money and perhaps even more money than the federal government itself raises. And so that puts them also in a very strong position, but also one where they can be seen as a criminal actor. So there are a lot of things at once, and it kind of depends on who you talk to and what frame they're taking in terms of how they see the group. I'd say, it really got its start in around 2007. Ethiopia had invaded Somalia to kind of dislodge the Islamic Courts Union, which was this group of conservative-leaning actors, which had solidified control over Mogadishu, but it represented a threat to Ethiopia, who was also always thinking about this greater Somalia idea, and the presence of some of these actors intertwined with the global war on terror, with U.S. concerns about some Al-Qaeda operatives in East Africa getting sanctuary there. And so after that invasion, Al-Shabaab kind of emerged as the youth wing of that movement and the forefront of resistance to Ethiopia. And so at that time, they were also very much viewed as kind of freedom fighters. There's that historic animosity we've talked about between Ethiopia and Somalia. And so this was seen for a lot of Somalis as the latest iteration of that. Ethiopia, even though it's an incredibly diverse country as well, is often portrayed in Somalia as sort of a Christian highland empire. And so, Al-Shabab, as the representative of Somalia's Muslim population, was fighting a war and very much popular in that sense, given the stance that they were taking. But over time, I think Al-Shabaab's popularity has probably waned a bit. They've resorted to a bit more repressive tactics, including those against their own civilian population. But at the same time, they do offer some key services, and that's where I talk about this competition with the federal government. There's some things service-wise that they just do better than the federal government, and part of that relates to corruption in the federal government. Part of that relates to how Al-Shabaab's able to, I wouldn't say resolve clan tensions, but sometimes clamp down on clan tensions. So there's a security benefit there. Part of it revolves around Al-Shabaab's justice system, which you always hear kind of stories and reports about people even living in government-held territories that travel out to Al-Shabaab territories to have a dispute resolved because they have such low levels of trust in the government system. And so, that's another facet of what Al-Shabaab is, as its competition with the federal government. So I think it's a lot of things to a lot of people, but the key aspect I point to is really, rather than just looking at Al-Shabaab purely as a terrorist actor, we have to look at them as a governing actor and really a competitor to the federal government itself.
Theoretically, though, if Al-Shabaab was to win their fight and capture the rest of Jubaland and form some sort of government, would Puntland or Somaliland accept this result?
Yeah, no, I don't think you'd have Puntland or Somaliland in particular, welcoming that or happy to work with them. Al-Shabaab still is a dangerous actor. It still threatens both of those entities. It's done attacks in both of them as well. So I don't think you'd have any sort of accommodation there. It'd still represent quite a challenge. Some of the precursors to Al-Shabaab, this movement in particular, AIAI, Al-Ittihad al-Islamiyya, had a presence in Puntland and was chased out more or less in the 90s. So Puntland's dealt with this before. They particularly one of their former leaders was very against this idea of Islamist actors like Al-Shabaab operating in that area. So I don't think you'd see an accommodation in that area. What you would see, though, is more and more so these days, people are questioning how the war against Al-Shabaab is going to end, basically. Are we involved in just kind of this endless struggle? Has the military side shown, the extent to which it can accomplish gains? And that's why we've been in a bit of a status quo the past few years. And so more this question of how you can either engage Al-Shabaab or accommodate them in some sort of way so they give up their violence is coming to the fore. And I think the experience of U.S. talking to the Taliban in Afghanistan is part of that.
So right now, peacekeepers from Amazon and the African Union are inside Somalia to help the fight against Al-Shabaab. But do you think they have the capacity to win this fight? And do you think they actually want to win this fight? Because to complicate things, the African Union is based in Ethiopia. And historically, a stronger, stabler Somalia is a threat to eastern Ethiopia. So with Somalia fighting itself, it's not as much of a threat to Ethiopia. So do you think they even want to win this fight?
Yeah, so that's always kind of the competing dynamic, especially when you look at Somalia's neighbors, Kenya and Ethiopia, this idea that they wanted a weakened Somalia, so this whole idea of Greater Somalia, and therefore, the threats that is implicit to their territories, that idea kind of dies out. But I do think the calculus of Al-Shabaab changes that a little bit, because now you do want a coherent governing structure in Somalia. So one, it can take on Al-Shabaab itself, and two, it can ensure such threats like that don't emerge again in the region. So I think that changes the calculus a little bit. The African Union mission in Somalia has been present there since 2007 and has made incredible progress in a very difficult situation, especially early on in the mission's tenure, when basically it was viewed as more or less dead on arrival. Al-Shabaab controlled Mogadishu already at that point, so they've been able to fight back and gain quite a bit of territory with this idea that they can then open up a space for Somali political processes to take root and take hold. And that has happened, certainly, to some degree. Now, has it happened to the degree everyone wants or expects, and has there been a slowdown over the past few years as a status quo sort of has set in? I think absolutely. And I think that's why some are kind of questioning whether we've hit the high water mark there, or whether some sort of greater impetus or revitalization of the mission can lead to more gains. But no one wants to reverse these gains, but we just haven't really figured out how to do that in a way that coincides with the realities of regional interests, that coincides with the realities of funding constraints and whatnot. So right now the mission is scheduled to hand over primary security responsibility to Somali security forces by the end of next year. But I think you'd be hard pressed to find an actor that would really say that Somalia is ready for that.
What we have now is an already fractured nation dealing with yet another external problem, where the authority of the government barely holds firm 100 kilometers outside of Mogadishu. And when there's lack of regulation, other actors will step in. And to talk more about that, we turn to our second guest.
Part 2. There's something in the water.
Yeah, I would describe it young, vibrant, growing city. That's how I would describe it. A recovering, of course, from the effects of the war, but also I would use the word huge potential to describe it.
Degan Ali is the executive director of the African Humanitarian and Development Organization, Adeso. She also has over 20 years of experience in humanitarian work in the region and grew up in the Somali capital of Mogadishu. She joins us today.
I think Mogadishu obviously is still reeling from insecurity and still has issues with explosions and assassinations and all of those things. It's far, far much better than it used to be historically. I've been around working in and out of Somalia and living in the region for almost 20 years now. So I've seen much, much worse situations. I remember a time when we couldn't even go into Mogadishu.
So what does the majority do for work? What does the average person do to make money in a country that doesn't have a huge amount of natural resources?
So the majority of the people are still involved in agriculture, whether it's nomadic pastoralism, where they are rearing livestock in very rural and really kind of harsh conditions for the average American citizen or Australian citizen. And those in South and Central Somalia are still heavily engaged in farming. But yeah, majority are trying to survive through agricultural production.
Somalia was in the headlines a few years ago as a hotspot for international piracy. So can you explain a bit about how and why piracy was so rampant a few years ago in the north of Somalia?
Well, the Somali pirates, as they have been, put on the big screen by Hollywood, it's not really, that's not how they started off. What Hollywood has portrayed as pirates is not the reality. Majority, or piracy, the beginning of piracy was actually local fishermen trying to survive and eke out a living from fishery production, and most of it was selling into the local markets. This is not large-scale fishing industry that is exported. This is all local production. So the local fishermen were being terrorized by international illegal trawling ships that were coming illegally into the Somali fishing waters. And so when the local fishermen tried to go deeper into the ocean, and this is still Somali territorial area, but because there's no Coast Guard and there's no strong government mechanisms, we're not able to protect our coastline. And so these trawlers would basically terrorize the Somali fishermen. And in the beginning, they would cut their nets so that they would not be competing with them. And then it became more and more insidious. They would be boiling water and dropping the water onto the fishermen. Eventually, they started getting guns and started shooting at the fishermen. All of that led the local fishermen to start taking arms. They said, we have to protect ourselves. We can't go out to sea without guns. And that resulted in eventually seizing the first illegal fishing boat, and that boat then they held the people for ransom. And I don't think they really expected that anybody would pay money. To be honest with you, I think it was just a fluke. And that ransom that was paid eventually led into what we know to be known now as piracy. And young people realized very quickly this was a very quick and easy cash. You just capture a ship and hold the people ransom and get paid. And more young people started getting involved in it as a way to earn money.
So in a usual piracy case, would the fishermen kill the people on board, or was it just a case of they'd occupy and then demand a ransom and then leave as quick as possible?
No, I don't know of any incidences of people being killed on purpose. Of course, these ransom incidences across the country that people have died, maybe in more with people being kidnapped, like from NGOs and stuff. But because they were more valuable alive for the money, and their intention was not to kill these trawlers. Their intention was to earn money from them.
And how did the international community respond to these piracy attacks?
They took a very strong, harsh security measure, and they basically, with NATO getting involved and all of that, and patrolling the Somali waters. I'm not sure if, according to international standards, if that was really legal, how that happened, but they wanted to protect their interests, and of course, so they started patrolling the Somali waters. And when the pirates started getting captured and being tried in international courts and going to jail, that was a massive deterrent. So I think the local community, of course, also put a lot of pressure on these pirates and to try to stop it. This is not something that the community wanted. There was a lot of antisocial behavior that the pirates were bringing into the communities because they were flush with these young, uneducated, young men were being flushed with so much money, and they would basically, the social structure, the respect of the elders, the control that the elders had was eroding. And so there was a lot of antisocial behavior that was coming up, whether it was drug abuse on the part of these young people or other things that was taking place. So the community actually was not happy. The majority of the community was not happy about the piracy and didn't want it to continue. And I think that also put some social pressure on these young men.
So what kind of money are we talking about here? What would a fisherman earn compared to someone who was, let's say, engaging in piracy?
A fisherman could earn maybe $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 a year, a couple $100 every month, depending on the day. And then your take in a ransom case could lead to you getting $20,000, $30,000. Actually, this is the interesting part, is that during the time of piracy, the height of the piracy, because the international trawlers were scared to come into Somali waters, we were actually seeing, up until Mombasa, we were seeing extremely high fish catch that hadn't been seen in years, you see. So there is a definite direct correlation between overfishing and illegal fishing, and actually piracy was actually having a positive consequence on fishery communities and their production and keeping the ecosystem, the marine ecosystem, healthy.
So the other huge problem Somali fishermen are facing is illegal dumping by Western nations, particularly Italian companies. The reports are suggesting that Italian firms were taking money for waste disposal and then dumping the garbage off the coast of Somalia. The most shocking part of this report also suggests that nuclear waste is being dumped into Somali territorial waters to save money on the expensive procedure of storing nuclear waste. This is now wreaking havoc on the local wildlife, directly affecting the fishermen. How do people get away with such a blatantly awful thing in Somali waters?
The communities have been saying this from the day I arrived in the country. In 1999, I've been hearing this. I believe it's probably true because it's not something that could be made up from the north to the south, because I've heard it all over. I work all over the country. I've heard it everywhere. So there were cases where warlords were, the rumors were that certain warlords had accepted to use Somali waters as a place to dump, and they had received compensation, or what I would call bribes, from governments like Italy. I mean, nothing surprises me. This wouldn't surprise me in the sense that, there's no altruism on behind of multi-billion-dollar corporations or from former colonies who have no vested interest in the development of, or actually have a vested interest in the underdevelopment of many countries in Africa. So I would, that wouldn't surprise me. There are more horrific things that have been done by European countries to Africa.
The other big thorn in the side of Mogadishu is Al-Shabab. And being there on the ground working with locals, how do you think Al-Shabab is viewed in Somalia?
Well, Al-Shabab are just people who are from the Somali community. They could be, they're normal people. They're not boogeymen sitting somewhere. They're basically, they have serious ideological differences with the government. They have serious ideological differences, I would probably say, with some of the religious leaders, mainstream religious leaders. And they believe that they need to impose that ideology by force. The history of Al-Shabab and how it started is actually quite interesting, because I was in Somalia in 2006 when the Islamic Courts Union, then called the ICU, took charge and took control of the capital. And the capital was really no man's land before that. It was just massive amounts of insecurity and so much injustice happening. And the ICU, the time that they had control over about a period of 6 months, they turned Mogadishu into the most peaceful, functioning, the courts were functioning, people were able to get justice. Before, you could have your property taken from you, you could have someone beat you or steal money from you or rape you if you were a woman. All types of things were happening with pure impunity. There was no legal system in place. So when I say legal, I mean even Islamic legal system in place, or even secular. And so they were bringing peace, but they also brought justice with them, and things were functioning. I actually remember a white woman, I think she was an American, who was with WFP, saying to me in a meeting, at one of these coordination meetings where the UN are and the INGOs, she said, for the first time in, I don't know, forever, since before the Civil War, we as WFP are able to actually target the minority populations, the Bantu populations around the Shabelle and the Juba rivers. I said, really? She said, yeah. And I said, why? She said, because the ICU, they're actually giving the food to the people who need it most, irrespective of whether they're minorities or whether they're the majority clan. And historically, what would happen is the majority clans would be gatekeepers, and they would ensure that they would take the lion's share or maybe everything of all the food aid. And here, for the first time, there was actually a system of governance that was trying to be fair and ensure, and this would all happen under the quote-unquote leadership of the warlords and different groups controlling the country. I also think that their ideology might be, they wouldn't be open to things around, things around what, they're obviously not open to liberal, democratic, quote unquote, principles and things around, freedom of speech and freedom of this and freedom of that, They want the country to be governed according to Sharia law. I would say the majority of the past 10, 15 years, in the height of the Al-Shabab times where they had more control of the country, the people felt generally supportive. The poor the ones under their rule felt more supportive of Al-Shabab because, again, they were getting justice. They were able to get immediate addressing of their issues. They were able to get services that weren't previously there. And in some ways, many people will say that we would prefer Shabab over the warlords or over the corruption of these governments. But at the same time, of course, some people might say that their tactics have become extremely brutal. And I think the bombings of universities and university students, I think in Mogadishu, that was a turning point in terms of public support of Al-Shabaab.
And Al-Shabaab's not just in Somalia, it also spills over into Uganda, Kenya, and a few other nations, is that correct?
I mean, they have done interventions in Uganda. They have obviously done several, horrific attacks in Kenya. Yeah, they have come there. I would see them as being very much regionally engaged because they see the Kenyan government and the Ugandan government as being allies to the Somali government and being part of the troops that are Amazon troops that are trying to remove Al-Shabaab from many parts of South Central. So they see them as part of their enemy. They don't see only the government as their enemy, but any allies of the government who are putting troops on the ground. These countries, especially the Kenyan government, has troops on the ground inside Somalia. So, but yeah, of course, the attacks that have happened in Kenya specifically have been quite grotesque and just horrific. Yeah. I mean, as I said, there are people who claim that there was an external influence into the formation of this group, but the leadership, as far as I know, and I, especially when it was the Islamic Courts Union, were all purely Somali. And when it split off and they became Al-Shabaab and different groups, then the leadership continued to be Somali, but there are people do say there were external influences like Al-Qaeda, but the leadership, I think, is still purely Somali.
The US particularly is opposed to Al-Shabaab, using a fairly extensive set of drone strikes against them in assistance of the Mogadishu government's fight. But how many drone strikes on average do you think the average Somali would be aware of?
I think far more common than we probably know, and probably reported by mainstream media. But yeah, they do happen. At least every year every year we hear of 3, 4, 5 strikes where people have died. So, yeah, I think so if those are the ones that are making the press, you wonder how many others are happening that we don't hear about, maybe because one person dies or maybe because people don't die. So, yeah, I think they're heavily, heavily involved.
It seems since the 1880s, Somalia has been at the mercy of external powers. A piece to be moved around the board. They've taken orders from the British, the French, the Italians, the Americans, and even the Russians, as well as many other small powers over the years. But what about now? With the US starting to turn away from open fire-off conflicts, what is the dynamic today? With the majority of foreign troops fighting in Somalia being from Amazon, the African Union's mission in Somalia, and not one of the usual great powers. How will this impact the region? And what will this mean for Somalia's relationship for the rest of East Africa? Well, to talk more about that, we turn to our third guest.
Part 3. Brick by Brick.
The last couple of times I've flown into Mogadishu have been quite dramatically different. I flew in the 1990s in the height of the Civil War and was not able to land at Mogadishu International Airport, such as it was. I had to land on airstrips outside the city because of what were called the sky checkpoints, which were the artillery barrages that were put up by various warlords to prohibit small planes from landing in parts of the city they didn't control. And so I, in the 90s, would land at these small places outside and drive across a very arid landscape into the city, as it were, through the back door. The last time I was in Somalia a year ago, I had my passport stamped, which is the first time I'd had that happen since the 1980s. And it had the accoutrements of being a regular international arrival. But that said, just around the airport, you have the infrastructure of the United Nations, which has a headquarters there, which is very heavily fortified and sandbagged against the attacks of the extremist group Al-Shabab. And most of the visitors actually live in quite some seclusion, segregation from the regular Somali life of the capital, which goes on.
Alex Duval is the Executive Director of the World Peace Foundation at Tufts University and a research professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Alex is an award-winning author of books such as The Real Politics of the Horn of Africa, and is often regarded as the foremost expert when it comes to the region. He joins us today.
Well, there's a concerted international effort to make Somalia look like a regular state. And Somalis like that. It is obviously extremely welcome that there are regular international flights, that there are many of the institutions of a standardized, institutionalized, bureaucratic government being set up. Somalis are extremely mobile. They travel a lot. So having passports, having international recognition, having embassies, having the documentation necessary for being a citizen of the modern world is desperately important. However, that facade doesn't go very far. The great majority of Somalia lives according to a different set of rules. And these are rules that have been rooted in a Somali culture, which derives from a lineage system popularly called a clan system, whereby all Somalis know one another by their ancestry on the male line, so everyone can immediately be identified. But it's also an extremely adaptable, modern commercial system. Somalis, even in remote rural areas, are very well connected, very commercially adept, very much linked through mobile phone networks and financial systems, not only across Somalia, but to East Africa, to the Middle East, to Europe and North America, and to Australia and as far as China.
The only neighbour Somalia never went to war with at some point was Djibouti, as it remained a part of France until as recent as 1977, and Somalia didn't really want to go to war with France. These days, Djibouti houses military bases for the US, France, Italy, Japan, and even China, with India and Saudi Arabian bases in negotiation at the moment. How does Somalia feel having so many large military players right there over the border?
Somalis became deeply suspicious of what international involvement would mean. And meanwhile, the international community had got its fingers badly burnt in Somalia and didn't want anything to do with it. And it really stayed that way for about 10 years. Somalia was left to itself during the 1990s. And actually, during that time, it was chaotic, but it began to establish a sort of local order in which there was a modicum of local government, and the business sector thrived and actually provided many of the essential services that Somalis needed. So the absence of a central government wasn't as calamitous as many had feared. That began to change after September the 11th, and the allegation, which had some truth to it, though it was much exaggerated, that Al-Qaeda was present in Somalia and was planning attacks. In fact, Al-Qaeda had essentially been removed from Somalia in the 1990s, partly by the Somalis themselves. partly by neighboring countries, especially Ethiopia, making military incursions, but above all because Al-Qaeda itself made mistakes. It found its extremist agenda wasn't very welcome there. But as the US began to get involved in Somalia remotely by conducting airstrikes and commando operations in the 2000s with the aim of rooting out people it suspected were extremists, that actually backfired in a very, very serious way. It ended up fostering the very extremism that it sought to eradicate. And then in 2006, the Ethiopians launched an invasion. They went in, they occupied Mogadishu, and their intent was to remove the Al-Shabab extremist group that had grown up, which it saw as an agent of destabilization. And the US came in behind the Ethiopians. And this was a disastrous move because it further compounded the radicalization of Somalia. It gave Al-Shabaab the nationalist mantle. It could now dress itself up as the force that was resisting continual air attacks by the United States and, perhaps more importantly, the occupation of large areas of Somalia by the Ethiopians, who had been historically the adversaries, the rivals, the foes of the Somalis.
Do you think there's a balancing act going on here from the international community? You know, if Somalia is too weak, it becomes a hotbed of terrorism and extremism, which will then spill over into the neighbouring countries. But if Somalia is too strong and stable, it may have plans to restake its claim on Greater Somalia. Do you think the governments in Nairobi and Addis Ababa are taking this into consideration when deciding how much aid and support to give to Somalia in this war?
I think you've got it just about right. Both those countries have their troops in Somalia. The Kenyans went in 2012 after terrorist attacks in Kenya. And each of them wants to impose its own form of order on Somalia. So it wants an orderly Somalia, but not a terribly strong Somalia. And they don't always agree among themselves. They have disagreed in their policies, and Somalis have become rather expert at manipulating the disagreements among those external interveners. The situation was further complicated by the fact that other countries became interested in Somalia. So during the famine, Turkey was very active. It provided humanitarian assistance. It provided assistance to state building, to training the army, and so on. And it did so because Turkey at that time was trying to build up a broader sphere of influence across the greater Middle East. And it was followed into Somalia by a number of other Middle Eastern actors, by Qatar, which was supporting the Muslim Brothers, by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, which was supporting anyone who would oppose the Muslim Brothers. They wanted to counterbalance the influence of Turkey and Qatar. And the UAE in particular also had commercial interests. It wants to build up a network of ports that it controls around the Indian Ocean in order to have its own extended foreign and commercial policy imprint across a wider region. So all these different actors have been piling into Somalia, each with their different agendas. And they brought with them quite a lot of money. They brought with them assistance to different security forces so that there is no real coherent Somali army or national security force. Each of the units has a different external sponsor and quite likely different foreign loyalties. And so the situation is chaotic and complicated and conflictual, but in a very different way to how it was some years ago when Somalia was neglected and Somalis were left to their own devices. Now they have too much intervention rather than too little.
So looking at the makeup of the current Mogadishu government, we can see that around 75% of them are actually diaspora returning to Somalia from the United States. And with so many members of government having lived and studied in the US, do you think that signals a future closeness between Washington and the current government in Mogadishu?
most Somalis who are educated or are active in politics or who have commercial links have several passports. Many of them have been educated abroad or who have had jobs or businesses in the United States or in Europe. So it's not a new thing for the diaspora to be involved in Somali politics. And they're pretty good at navigating the different political currents they see. They're certainly not going to follow the US blindly. That said, the US has a major stake in Somalia, particularly in the National Intelligence and Security Agency. And the US has a continuing active campaign of assassinating figures whom it suspects are terrorists or whom rival Somalis have tipped off to the Americans. This guy's a terrorist, and for their own particular reasons of personal or political or commercial rivalry, have identified this person, and the US has very gullibly gone in and eliminated them. So the US is certainly not a force for stability in Somalia, and the Somalis are well aware of that. But they've learned to live with the deep and penetrating presence of foreign powers that do not have Somali interests at heart. And at the moment, the way that Somali politicians navigate this is they do it in a very tactical manner. They pursue their own rather narrow political interests by playing off these international actors against one another. There isn't anything that one can really call a strong national coherent Somali platform for rebuilding the country. There's certainly ideas in that direction. There's certainly many Somalis who would like to see it and who have very good ideas and positive proposals about what the shape of new Somali government and new Somali society should look like, but they're all the time bumping up against the brute political realities of surviving from month to month.
So we know Washington has its inroads into the Somali government, but is China also trying to make connections with Somalia?
China's has a number of major investments in the wider region, because Somalia is right in the middle of its Belt and Road initiative geography. China's first overseas military base is its naval base that it has set up in Djibouti. It has major investments in the rail infrastructure, the railroad from Djibouti to Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, and also a railroad investment in Kenya, and a number of other types of commercial, military, strategic investments in the region. Will it get more deeply involved in Somalia? Probably not until it sees a partner that it can do business with in a rather conventional and predictable manner, until it sees that there are infrastructural investments that will repay the money that it pours in. So it's certainly watching Somalia very closely. Whether or not it's going to get more deeply involved, I think the answer is probably not for now.
So staying on the topic of funding, we know Al-Shabab gets some money from collecting taxes in the areas they control, as well as selling what it can. But are there other countries pouring money into Al-Shabab to help destabilize Mogadishu's position?
There was a time when Al-Shabab was getting considerable support from private individuals and companies in the Middle East. And in fact, at the time when Al-Shabab made its formal affiliation with Al-Qaeda in 2012, bin Laden actually sent a message to them saying, don't do this, because the moment you identify yourself with Al-Qaeda, it's going to be very difficult for the Saudis and others in the Gulf to turn a blind eye to the private individuals in those countries that are sending money to Al-Shabaab. And he was right. Most of the international flows of finance to Al-Shabab were cut off in the years that followed. And Al-Shabab ran its operations, and still does, very much on a shoestring with local commercial smuggling operations. And it's been quite effective at buying off corrupt officials and military officers, particularly in Kenya and in one or two other countries.
There are a number of reports indicating European companies have been dumping everything from garbage to nuclear waste into Somali waters. Do you give those reports any credibility?
Absolutely no doubt that a number of corporations, often with the unacknowledged backing of their governments, used the Somali waters for all sorts of illegal things, starting with dumping, but carrying on with massive fishing. And the overfishing and the poisons that were dumped there in the 1990s and early 2000s essentially killed off the Somali fishing business. So the local Somali fishermen, what did they do? They turned to piracy. And initially they turned to piracy as, in a rather non-violent way, they would take ships without killing people because they didn't want to up the stakes. They knew that if it came to a shooting war, they certainly couldn't win against the navies of the world. And so they made money instead by the scam of hostage taking. And they provoked, of course, an international response, which had several parts, one of which was forcible eradication of piracy by shooting at pirates. But the chief way in which Somali piracy was overcome was actually by paying the pirates to become coast guards. And one way in which this happened was the United Arab Emirates was funded the government of Puntland to set up a presidential sort of mercenary army as a counter-piracy group. And more widely in Mogadishu, various groups were given money to act as coast guards, so that when the material rewards for being coast guards outweighed those of being pirates, many Somalis abandoned piracy. And at the moment, it's a very minor activity in the Somali economy. And fishing has, in the meantime, resumed, and dumping has been, the illegal dumping of toxic waste in Somali waters has been reduced. Not completely eliminated, but reduced.
So many people are calling for the African Union soldiers to leave. But what do you think would happen if all the peacekeepers were to leave Somalia?
I think there's really no prospect of them pulling out wholesale. I think the African Union mission in Somalia, which is essentially not a peacekeeping operation, but actually a warfighting mission, is going to be drawn down. It is vastly expensive and not very effective. But when it does draw down, the alternative scenarios are going to be a resurgence of Al-Shabab and a security vacuum in many areas. Essentially, Somalia gets trapped in this cycle of it's alternately neglected by the world and then interfered with by the world, and neither of those options really gives the opportunity for Somalis to work out their own system of government and to develop their own society.
Do you think Somalia would ever follow the divisions and break apart into three nations, being Somaliland, Puntland, and Jubaland?
Puntland, of course, has no agenda of independence. It wants to be a partner with the government in Mogadishu as part of a single Somalia, but it wants Puntland to have the status of a federal state plus a sort of almost a confederal system. Somaliland still demands independence, and it has been doing so for almost 30 years now. Is it likely to get it? If it hasn't got it up to now, it doesn't seem likely that it will achieve it. It has managed to achieve much better governing institutions than Mogadishu. And the success of its governance model is a standing rebuke and a standing challenge to Mogadishu.
So what does the next decade hold for Somalia? How can they solve the Al-Shabab problem and regain some reasonable stability?
There has to be a process of negotiation, and the most immediate negotiation that Mogadishu has to become involved in is with Al-Shabab. That's the number one challenge. And around the world, we have relearned a very hard lesson, which is that you can't defeat terrorist groups militarily. You have, at the end of the day, to deal with them politically. And that involves negotiating with them. And the government in Mogadishu will have to do that. But in order to do that, it will have to get more legitimacy and more capability itself, while it remains essentially in the hands of foreign powers. Al-Shabaab is not going to negotiate with it. It would say, why negotiate with Mogadishu? I would rather negotiate with Washington or with Riyadh or Abu Dhabi. That kind of turmoil is very familiar territory for Somalia. Somalis have come to live with, survive, and indeed prosper in with a high degree of turbulence. And so I expect that the qualities that will see Somalia continue to function are precisely the ones that have got it through the last 30 years. Their very strong networks, their international interlinkedness, their financial and commercial acumen, and their readiness to adapt very, very quickly to changing regional and international circumstances. So I don't see any immediate prospect of the federal government of Somalia forging a workable central state on the conventional bureaucratic administrative model. I see more of this continuing dance of different actors juggling their priorities, renegotiating their political relationships, their frameworks for governance in a very unstable world.
I went into this piece expecting to be reporting on a frankly failed state, sinking further and further into a black hole. But I leave this piece with some hope. Somalia is in a tough position, with no one wanting to see it really get back on its feet, as every time it has, its neighbours have felt its power. The international community dumps into its waters, and then intervenes when the people start fighting back against the very warlords and officials who signed off on it. And really, being as poor as they are, there's not much they can really do about it. Because these same communities that are dumping in the waters are also the same ones helping keep Mogadishu out of the hands of Al-Shabab. So they have to decide who is worse, Al-Shabab or dumping. So progress is always incremental, brick by brick by brick. But there is something to say about the Somali brick by brick attitude that gives me hope for the country. When we were researching for this story, we came across a man named Ahmed, who owns a restaurant in downtown Mogadishu. The restaurant employs around 150 people and has become a hotspot in the city. Sadly though, the restaurant has been attacked by suicide bombers, active shooters and car bombs several times now. But every time it gets destroyed, Ahmed picks himself back up, dusts himself off, and builds up the restaurant again. And he opens up every single time as an act of defiance, a refusal to be down and out no matter how bad the situation is. To me, Ahmed is Somalia, a country constantly knocked down, that by all rights should be way worse off than it already is. But it isn't. It is improving. And that is almost completely in credit to the will of the individual Somalis. If anyone could salvage the current situation, it would be them. And I really hope they do. Thank you so much again for tuning into the program. Once again, each month keeps getting bigger and bigger. If you want to follow the show, you can find us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at The Redline Pod, or you can follow me personally on Twitter at MikeElliottOz. Oz is in Australia. Although the main group I can contribute the success of the show to is our amazing Patreons, who donate to the show each month and help us keep this thing running. Every single dollar they donate brings us more help to chase bigger stories, bring on more people, and we are incredibly fortunate to have them. And to say thanks, we're having another one of our Patreon meetups and live Q&As with myself coming up next week. So if you sign up to Patreon this week, you'll be able to jump on that with myself and ask your most burning questions to me, whilst also helping to support the show. A huge thank you goes out to all of our guests this week. Omar was incredibly knowledgeable in the subject and a real pleasure to work with. He also does some amazing work over at the Crisis Center. Omar and his colleagues as well run a fantastic geopolitics podcast called The Horn, all about the geopolitics of East Africa. If you want to dive even deeper into the East of Africa, I highly recommend you check it out. You can find Omar on Twitter at Omar S. Mahmood. And you can also find The Horn on Spotify and Apple playlists. Degan really does some amazing work throughout the region and gave us fantastic insight to what things are like on the ground there. Her work with Adeso has been fantastic, with some real results. And if you want to help them, you can find them on Twitter at Adeso Africa. I also know that Degan is about to launch her own African geopolitics show in a few months, and I know that it will be added to my weekly playlist. So if you want to stay up to date on all of this, you can find her on Twitter at Degan Ali. Before we even started looking at this piece, I had 2 separate emails urging me to have Alex Duval on the show, as he's the pinnacle of East Africa. And having done the interview now, I fully agree with both of them. Alex was a fantastic guest, and his work with the World Peace Foundation has made real impacts in the region. I highly recommend you check out one of his many books, and also go over and see the World Peace Foundation on Twitter on the handle at WorldPeaceFDTN. As usual, I also want to thank my fantastic team, Joe, who helps me clean up the audio, and Mark, who provides the extra vocals that are not mine. Both of these guys run absolutely fantastic shows in their own right, Joe's being called Estimates and Mark's being the Climacting Network. Both of them are amazing, amazing shows, and I highly recommend you check them out, not just because they're good guys, but also because they're good shows. The last thank you goes out to you for tuning in this week. I really, really do appreciate it. I read all of the comments and DMs that get sent through the show, and it really does mean a lot to you to see so many people reach out and ask their questions to me. So thank you very much. We'll be back in another fortnight with another international episode. But for now, thank you and good night.